So one of the things that I've been studying and thinking about is high achievement in among people in general, and this is also something that I don't think is given any serious consideration in our discussion of the differences between the sexes. So, the number of people who are extremely high achieving in any field is very low, right? And that depends on the Pareto principle essentially, and that works itself out mathematically so that the square root of the number of people in a domain do half the work. So if you have 100 scientists working in a particular subfield, then 10 of them will publish half the articles. And if you look at that tiny percentage of people who are hyperproductive, they're almost all men.
Yeah.
And so like in universities, the median number of publications for men and women is very close. But the high publishers are all men. And the reason for that is because in order to be in that category, not only do you have to be extraordinarily smart and extraordinarily conscientious, but associated with that conscientiousness, you have to be able to devote something like 60 to 80 hours a week of solid attention to your job, because otherwise people will outcompete you, right? So it's these extremely focused and narrow people who are
obsessive.
That's exactly right. They're absolutely obsessed with what they're doing, and they're quite rare, and that they're also the mystery that needs to be solved, because the fact that most people want to have a balanced life and that most people aren't absolutely obsessed with a single issue to the exclusion of all else is actually normative behavior and quite understandable.
That's right.
You get this extreme personality, let's say, and it's certainly not something I'm criticizing, but it's not the common lot. And I do believe that it's a far more difficult thing for women to manage, because once you're responsible for someone else, like you are primarily responsible for small children, then it's extraordinarily difficult to concentrate like that to the exclusion of all else. And, I've seen a couple of women that I've had professional relationships with. I've usually worked in the capacity of something like an executive coach in my clinical practice, who've kind of managed that, but they're so stretched. They're concerned with the number of seconds that they have to microwave their food. They're hyper organized, and even then it's very difficult for them to manage, because they're juggling 4 or 5 impossible things at the same time, and often also guilt-ridden because they feel that they're not paying enough attention to their children. And generally they are, and they make very good role models, but it's a hell of a thing to expect of someone who also has a maternal role. It isn't obvious that it's even possible, and that's another thing we can't have a serious conversation about, because there's all sorts of lies, I would say, about how it's the glass ceiling or male models of success that are stopping women from succeeding at that high level, and that isn't right. What stops people from succeeding at that high level is it's virtually impossible to begin with, and all you need is one more impediment, and then you can't manage it.
Yeah, that's right. Camille Paglia has said that feminism has never acknowledged the guilt that women feel when they are when they have children and they are working and they pursue their careers. And I've seen it at workplaces where I've worked, where women are high achieving, they've got their PhDs, they're there working full time, and they are racked with guilt. And I don't think that happens to men nearly to the same degree. And
I don't think it happens to men really at all.
Yeah.
And I mean, it hasn't been my observation that it happens to men. It happens to women all the time.
All the time.
I've done an awful lot of coaching with high achieving women. I did that for about 10 years. And, these were women who were pretty much outstanding in multiple dimensions, but what would also, this was mostly in the field of law, and so most of them were in their early 30s, and not only were they racked with guilt if they had children and weren't spending as much time as they wanted with them, but they were also racked with guilt when they did spend time with their children, because then they weren't spending enough time on their career, and so they were basically screwed both ways. And it wasn't merely a matter of, let's say, high negative emotional sensitivity, because that is a biological difference between men and women, although I would say some of the women that I coached were quite feminine and were more prone to anxiety than might have been good for them. But it was merely a response to what's essentially an impossible situation. And it's also not something that there's an easy answer to. I mean, what I would recommend to them was that they outsource all of the domestic duties they could possibly manage. And most of the successful women did that. They had nannies. They outsourced everything they could, including their laundry. And they tried to rid themselves of any domestic duties that could be parceled out to a third party. And that's necessary. It's not optional if you want to pursue a career at a high level. But it also requires a pretty high standard of living to be able to pull that off, because it's not like childcare of any quality is extremely expensive. And it's very difficult to bring that cost down, because with young children, you need a very high ratio of caregiver to child, like 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. And so if you have someone who's even vaguely qualified and you pay them, say, $40,000 a year, which is pretty low, double that for overhead, so that's $80,000. So just the bare minimum cost of the highest quality of quasi-institutional care for children is easily $20,000 per child per year. And there's no easy way of forcing that cost down. The arithmetic is very straightforward. So it's a major societal problem, and it isn't clear that... And what's unfortunate is that we're not having serious conversations about this, because we pretend that the barriers are, well, a consequence of something like patriarchal oppression or straightforward, prejudice against women, and that's just simply not the case.
The irony is that to make things easier for middle-class professional women, you need more working-class women who can do cleaning and nannying work. So if you get to make life easier, you need a cohort of lowly paid women, which I don't think would help the gender gap, if that makes sense.
Yes,
you'll have two tiers of
that's another
highly paid women, and then
that's exactly right. That's another under discussed topic, which is that you end up transferring the primary, let's say, maternal burden, domestic burden, onto they're generally ethnic minority people. That's very, very common. And I mean, it's not necessarily a bad bargain for them, given their comparative options, let's say. But it's very difficult to pay someone who's doing domestic work enough so that they can have a reasonable standard of living, because, partly because it's just so expensive to do so. So it's an intransigent problem, to say the least. And it would be nice if we could actually have a serious and compassionate discussion about it. And I think the compassion part is to actually take a harsh look at such factors as the biological clock, which certainly make women's lives much more complicated up till their 40s. It seems to me that men might have more complicated lives in the latter part of their life, because, of course, we die about 8 years earlier and our health problems are more extreme and all of that. But I think that men's situation in life is somewhat simpler than women, certainly up to the age of about 40. And it's unfortunate that we can't address that squarely and start to figure out what to do about it. Not that it's a simple thing, because it's certainly not.
Well, some places do better than others. I think it's in Holland, I think in some of the Scandinavian countries, many women work part-time, and that's found to be quite productive for their economy, and women are happy working part-time. So, I think some societies are a little bit more progressive in answering some of these questions. However, there's still this. I don't know if any Western culture has many honest conversations about biological sex differences. We don't have it in Australia. It doesn't seem like we have it in Canada or America. I don't know if it happens in the Scandinavian countries. Probably
I don't see any evidence that it does. I mean, the Scandinavians are always concerned that there's overrepresentation of men in the STEM fields, for example, especially in engineering, even though I think the data is pretty clear that the idea that men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people is pretty damn robust finding, and the differences aren't small either. I mean, and the biological difference literature has been quite I think, quite productive, because basically what it's indicated is that there doesn't seem to be really much difference in men and women with regards to raw intellectual ability. The mean IQ is pretty much dead on exactly the same. Now, there is a little debate about whether the standard deviation is the same, with some evidence suggesting that men have a flatter standard deviation, so there's more hyper geniuses and there's more men who are intellectually impaired. Certainly there's more men who are intellectually impaired on the learning disability end of this distribution, for example. And even small differences in standard deviation can make huge differences out at the ends of the tails. So, but I would say the evidence for that is mixed. It's not conclusive. But the evidence for difference in personality, I think, is absolutely conclusive, and the evidence for difference in interest is even more conclusive. The effect sizes are extremely large.